Good evening, everyone. My name is Gilbert, and on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event with Jon Wiener, Harry Gamboa Jr., and Devra Weber as they discuss Jon's book, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s, co-authored by Mike Davis. We are so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this uncertain time. And Vroman's Live will continue to host virtual events for the foreseeable future, and you can learn more about them on our website as well as our social media. Our next event is tomorrow, Saturday, August 29th at 2 p.m. as Vroman celebrates Indie Bookstore Day with a virtual event featuring graphic novelist Ed Brubaker. Now, this particular event is ticketed, so please visit our website or Eventbrite for more information. For regular updates on upcoming Vroman's Live events, please feel free to subscribe to our newsletter. Now, tonight's virtual event will have a Q&A component. So to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen right over there. Now, if you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button with this little arrow on the side of the question, and that'll bump it up towards the top, the more popular it is. Now, we will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Also, if you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's featured book, you can click on the buy button directly below the viewer screen right there. This link will redirect you to the Vroman's Bookstore website where you can continue your checkout process. Now, Vroman's is also open daily, 10:30 to 6 p.m. For in-store shopping with strict health guidelines in place. So please visit our website to learn more about that if you want to go into the store to purchase a copy. Now, with that being said, let me introduce our author and guests for this evening. The co-author of the book is Jon Wiener. He is a longtime contributing editor at The Nation and host and producer of Start Making Sense, the magazine's weekly podcast. His guests there have included Naomi Klein, Gail Collins, Chris Hayes, Paul Krugman, Rebecca Solnit, and Barbara Enright. Now, he is an emeritus professor of U.S. history at UC Irvine, and his books include Give Me Some Truth, The John Lennon FBI Files, and How We Forgot the Cold War, A Historical Journey Across America. He'll be joined by Devra Weber, who is a professor of history at UC Riverside, as well as an author, writer, and photographer, including during the Chicano movement events of this book's era. Now, she is active in Los Angeles community affairs and has served as a member of the board of One Stop Immigration and Education Center, Los Angeles Museum of Art, History, and Culture, and is currently a member of the board of the Southern California Library for Social Studies. He'll also be joined by Harry Gamboa Jr., who is an artist, writer, and educator, currently a faculty member and co-director of the School of Art program in photography and media at Cal Arts. He is the founder and director of the international performance troupe Virtual Verite. He is also co-founder of OSCO, the legendary Los Angeles-based performance group. During the 60s in LA, Gamboa was a high school activist. Now, with all that being said, let me turn it over to our panel. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert.
Thank you, Gilbert. You look great.
Thank you.
I first of all, I bring greetings from Mike Davis. He's sorry he can't be here. Mike is working full time to finish a book on coronavirus. Hopes to bring it out in November. So he's kind of moved on from the 60s, and I'm sure Vroman's will be carrying that book when it comes out in whatever, 6 months or a year or something like that. So we're talking tomorrow. We're talking about tomorrow. Tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the Chicano moratorium, when 20,000 people marched down Whittier Boulevard calling for an immediate end to the war in Vietnam. It was a huge surprise to the mainstream media and the conventional wisdom, because their view of the Mexican American community, as they called it, was that this was a patriotic community. These were people, unlike, especially in contrast to the black world of Los Angeles. The Mexican Americans had come here because they wanted to. You know, blacks came here, were brought here as slaves. Mexican Americans were considered to be more conservative than blacks because they were supposedly all very religious Catholics. They were family oriented. They were work oriented. And this was again contrasted with the blacks who had family pathologies. There was a headline in the LA Times at the time of the Watts riots that said, racial unrest led to Negro family failure. Mexican Americans wanted to work. Blacks, people like Ronald Reagan said, just want to be on welfare. So there was this sharp contrast drawn between these two communities. And Republicans this was kind of their political strategy for a long time. They thought they could recruit Mexican American voters as a counterweight to blacks who were Democrats. And indeed, there was a mayoral election in 1969, the year before the moratorium, where Tom Bradley, who later became the first black mayor of Los Angeles, was running for the first time. And he lost the Mexican American vote. I think maybe 2/3 of Mexican American voters in 1969 in the city of Los Angeles voted for Sam Yorty. The old timers may remember that name. He was a notorious racist, horrible person, but he was the alternative to the black candidate. Tom Bradley did become mayor 4 years later, and that's a different story. So August 29th, 1970 was a huge surprise to the mainstream media. This patriotic community turned out to be against the war. This was a historic turning point, not just for Mexican Americans, but for American politics. And it made a huge impression. I had recently just arrived in town, but Devra and Harry were here, were on the scene. They were both young people, teenagers. Harry was just a kid. But I'd like to start by asking each of them what they remember about that day, August 29th, 1970, 50 years ago tomorrow. Devra, what were you doing? What about you on that day?
Well, I'll tell you, I was 23 and had been in Southern California again since 1968. And a friend of mine who was at that point a graduate student professor now, Juan Quinones, had asked me to work with people on a newspaper. I agreed and became a photojournalist for Chicano Movement newspaper and also Casa newspaper. So that morning, I basically headed out to LA with my camera and spent several hours walking along the parade route, taking photographs of families and gatherings and groups of students in UMass and also some metrics of people who come from Denver and other states joined. It was a very joyous and festive occasion. There was even a wedding couple that joined in their just married dress. It was very joyous without any problem until, of course, we got to the park. And people sat down. There were kids actually that were dancing, and in the front where there were buses aligned in back of the park, of Laguna Park then, there were speakers and children who were dancing on stage. It was fun. I was talking to friends, taking photographs, but mostly just enjoying the joy of this huge gathering of 20 to 30,000 people. And also remember there had been the blowouts that had happened in 68, 69, 70. So there were those years when I think of LA were getting a lot more used to the politics of Chicanos and East LA. So I was having a good time to that, and I'll talk about the other part later.
I'm sorry, real quick. This is Gilbert coming in. Devra, you have an echo on your microphone.
Yes, a horrendous echo. What do I do about it?
I think just to make sure your other windows, if you have other windows that are open, close those. Particularly if you have a second one of Crowdcast open, that occasionally happens.
Oh, thank you. Is that
that should usually that's the issue. Is everything closed now?
Did I just lose you guys?
Yeah,
Yeah, we're with you. We're with you.
we're still
Thank
here.
you. Hold
We're
on
still
to me, please, as I go through this.
Deborah, you were
Sorry
happy.
about this.
You were happy, and you were a student of Juan Gomez Quinones, who is a historic figure. Those of us who are around UCLA
Absolutely.
knew
Well,
Juan
he was
very
a
well.
friend of mine,
Mhm.
and that's how I got involved with it. Because he had said, "You take photographs, can you help me out?" I said, "Sure." And so I've still got Mike's terrible. Wait,
Gilbert, are we happy yet?
It still
we're
sounds
not.
like there's an echo. You can still hear it, Devra, yourself?
Hold on.
Oh.
Should maybe this is a great time for Harry to talk.
No,
Harry,
it's-
you were about what, 16 years old or
No,
something?
no, actually, I was 18 years of age, and one of the reasons I was there was because I had been involved in the East LA walkouts of 1968, but at the age of 18, I was of draft age, and many of my friends had already been killed in Vietnam. They had been drafted. They were encouraged to join the Marines at the age of 17, by the way, with the parental approval. So I had friends that died at the age of 17. And of course, as we've all read, Richard Nixon in particular had a great intent on making sure that every single Chicano possible would get drafted because Chicanos were dying at a disproportionate rate in the war. And maybe sort of a reflection on the patriotism. Of course, Mexican Americans had been involved in World War I, World War II. My grandfather's brothers all fought in World War II, along with my uncles and my father. And of course, many people didn't come to Los Angeles. They simply had been here since before the Mexican-American War. And so, I have always felt quite at home in Los Angeles because it's absolutely where it's been the whole time. And I was on the streets that particular day because this was taking place virtually in my own backyard. And I knew many, many different people at that point, and I was very involved in the movement and knew many of the people who were influential at that point in time. And many of these people had been my mentors, people who had actually even had served on the Zoot Suit Defense Committee, which, and I'm not sure if all of your listeners are aware of this, but President Roosevelt actually sent out several platoons of soldiers to harm and injure and kill Mexican Americans that basically had introduced some new influences. They were basically people from El Paso, Texas, who had a different point of view than the people who had been in Los Angeles. And to some extent, they were basically the first group of Chicano artists and met with gunfire. And so I was the second generation to be also met with gunfire.
And the other, hi, Devra, great to have you back.
I am probably signing in the wrong thing because I can still hear the feedback.
Well, here you are.
It sounds a little bit better. It's not completely gone, but
well,
sounds
of
better.
course, the second historic part of that day was when hundreds of sheriff's deputies, the march was in East LA, that's east of the city boundary, that's county territory patrolled by the sheriffs, not by the LAPD. So hundreds of sheriffs came pouring out of the side streets, declared the park, the gathering in the park an unlawful assembly, and then just started beating people, including women. There were a lot of families there, multi-generational families, to drive them out of the park, completely unexpected, completely unmotivated. There was nothing bad going on in the park. As Devra said, it was a festive, happy occasion at the end of this historic, wonderful march. And of course, when the sheriffs attack, the mothers and the daughters and the parents, young Chicano men, fight back. And so then there's fighting with the sheriffs in the park, and more sheriffs show up. And sort of that's the horrible way the story ended. 3 people died. One of them, of course, was Ruben Salazar, the first Mexican-American journalist for the LA Times and a reporter on, what was it, KMEX, prominent voice, spokesman, reporter, journalist, professional, not an activist, a professional journalist. He had gone with a TV crew from KMEX into the Silver Dollar Cafe to kind of recover from what was going on. Sheriffs showed up outside, shot a projectile through the open door, which was covered by a curtain. This was not a tear gas grenade, which is the way it's often described. It was a 9-inch long projectile designed to penetrate doors and walls. It was specifically marked not for crowd control. It hit Ruben Salazar in the head, and he died there. The deputy who shot that, Thomas Wilson was his name, didn't even go in to see what had happened. He and his fellow sheriffs just moved on to the next site they were trying to clear. There was a inquest. Of course, there was a massive outrage that this leading, well-known figure, well-known to Anglo-LA, to the LA Times, had been killed in this horrible way. The inquest never disciplined Deputy Thomas Wilson for anything, even though this was a complete misuse of this weapon. And it's still a little mysterious of why they shot into the bar. Salazar had said beforehand he was worried, he was afraid, he believed he was being followed, he believed he was in danger. And we really feel we've never gotten the full story of what happened that day, partly because the inquest was so biased and inadequate. So that's the way the story of that day ended. And this is also the conclusion, as both of our witnesses have said, to 2 years of high school activism. I mean, one of the most striking things that Mike Davis and I write about in our book is how young a lot of the demonstrators were in this whole period. There were parents, there were kids, but there were a lot of high school kids. There were even junior high school kids. In many ways, it was a youth event. And that had all started with a series of what they called the blowouts at the Mexican-American high schools of East LA. And we are very lucky to have with us today one of the leaders of the Chicano blowouts of 1967, 68, 69. Harry, tell us what you were up to and what was going on.
Well, it's kind of difficult to explain what the experience would have been for a young Chicano to go to school, but one would have to kind of revisit that period of time in Los Angeles, which kind of resembled apartheid South Africa. So it was signage and kind of behavior attitudes, very much English only, that was enforced with violence. The schools that I attended had the highest dropout rates, the lowest test scores. This was all somewhat purposely incorporated. The idea of the Vietnam War was introduced to all the young men when we were still in junior high school, and sort of everyone given the idea that you weren't going to live very long to begin with anyway. And the kind of corporal punishment, which normally sounds like someone is going to get a SWAT, actually involved various levels of brutality in the schools, and the kind of treatment and the overall racism was so overt. But this contradicted the kind of attitude that the young Chicanos had. We were the first television generation. We were tuned into the same kind of national information that other people were. And we were motivated to be intellectual and creative and musical, actually. And what happened was, fortunately, we were able to, I was fortunate to be introduced to many people who had been activists since the 1940s. So people like Bert Corona, Ralph Paron, Francisco Flores, you name it. And to encounter even on many occasions, Oscar Zeta Costa, and it's sort of a whole wide-ranging umbrella of intellectuals, activists, scholars, strategists, people who had fought, and basically every single male was a military veteran and had shown some bravery. And And of course, this environment was sort of the social environment. The physical environment was that we were all breathing irradiated smog here in Los Angeles at that time because of the nuclear blasts, and things were really rather bleak on one level, and the creation of the freeways in Los Angeles to specifically harness in a population. And all of this was a Cold War, which is usually not included in the experience, but there were many people that were involved. And of course, if you go to the UC Santa Barbara Chicano Studies Library and look at the papers of Oscar Zetacosa, you will see that probably nearly half of the names have been blacked out because they were basically all undercover agents trying to interfere with the development of civil rights. And we know all about COINTELPRO, of which I was placed on a list, thanks to J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon, and of course with the discredited PDID that was out to influence the results and making sure that Chicanos would not be organized. And you did mention at the park that there was sheriffs, but I was present, and in the surrounding neighborhoods, there were also members of LAPD, Highway Patrol, members of the military, undercover agents, were all intertwined. And at the park, it did start off simply with beatings and tear gas, which of course is in violation of wartime gear. But on the streets of East LA and Whittier, they were using live ammunition, of which many people were shot. And of course, the newspapers at that point only did an undercount, and many people were wounded. And I'm absolutely not sure how many people were actually harmed fatally.
Yeah, we don't know. We don't know how many people were shot. There's stories, of people rescuing people who had been shot, taking them to hospitals, taking them home, and so on. And they never did get their names, and the totals were never recorded. Devra, the high school. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to raise the point that Harry's giving about the broad support within communities and of the families. And also, I'm a historian, and I really see it as sort of this multi-generational involvement. And often people aren't aware, don't remember that in Los Angeles, you had Mexicans still alive, part of the Partido Liberal Mexicano, a binational organization for the Mexican Revolution. Many of those organized cells of industrial workers of the world, all Spanish-speaking. In the 1930s, people of Mexican had also joined the strike. They were involved in strikes in California agriculture, which amounted to a general strike. Some joined the Communist Party. And although your book mentions that the communists left Los Angeles, the Mexican communists were still there. And so you had people like Julia Luna Mount, Celia Luna Rodriguez, who had been involved in strikes in the cannery down on the port in the 30s. You had Bert, who really, I'm so glad you mentioned Harry, because he's a national figure involved in unions, involved in organized, involved in immigrant rights from the 1920s on. And was then the head of MAPA, the Mexican American Political Association. But he really, by being hurt and his interests and activities, really that organization to the left. And he continued, of course, in work until he died in 2000, right? So you have all these people that were there putting into it a lot of those stories, and also the grandparents of a number of people that were active had been in the revolution themselves. It wasn't something abstract. It was your grandpa at the breakfast table or your grandmother. So that there was an aliveness and a link to that. And so that you had some people that had been in the part of progressive movements that had study groups, and people who were, high school students were in those study groups. So when I think of that, I don't think it's well known, but it's so important. And it was the meetings at Capes with Sal Castro, but also the whole grouping of people then, including Juan Lopez and other people, leaders in the blowouts, to be there for about 2 or 3 different summers. these study groups, older people, the EIC meetings. I just think of it as this very rich community event. That really is how I became a historian in this area, because I all those people, and I said, "Oh God, this history isn't really known. There needs to be more about it." So I just wanted to add what Harry said.
Thanks. You know, Harry, there's a very famous picture of you from this period, and I've never had a chance to ask you about it, and this is my big chance. There's a picture of Harry when he's, I guess, 16 years old, with Bobby Kennedy and a couple of other young Chicano guys. This must have been like in the weeks in the 1968 Democratic primary when Bobby Kennedy was running for president against Gene McCarthy. And he was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Must have been a couple of weeks later. What's the story behind the picture of you and Bobby Kennedy?
Well, Bobby Kennedy actually was flying back from having visited Cesar Chavez that same day. So if you look at photographs of Bobby Kennedy with Cesar, he's wearing the same suit, the same button. He came by to offer his support to the Chicano students in the walkouts, and we were able to spend a couple of hours with him. He was gracious enough to hold court at the Santa Monica Airport, of all places. And so we were able to talk a little bit about that. It was very, of course, inspiring at that moment to meet such a great figure, of course. And it was on some level, a level of validation, but many of the people that made this possible, of course, were involved in the Democratic Party, of course. Someone by the name of Dionisio Morales had set this up, and I was one of the people who just happened to be on site. And I was, again, my kind of situation was that, and Devra was mentioning study groups. I found public education to be a little bit not up to the speed I needed to, so I found myself always on the streets and encountered many different kinds of study groups and different types of people and people with real life experiences that have served me well over time, and got a chance to meet many of the different figures that were involved in the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the Ban the Bomb movement, and many other people. And then what also was involved with many of the younger people who spent their lifetimes, early lifetimes, working to achieve empowerment amongst Chicanos. So I had a chance to meet many of the people who have now served elective office, many people that went on to become either filmmakers or other kinds of people that would influence through culture or through their actions. And again, many of us were really motivated because it seemed very obvious that there was sort of a absence of young men and other people, by the way. And this had to do with many different types of activities that had been taking place. And a lot of that had to do also in the 1950s, where there was a sterilization program. So there were many women who were unable to even bear children, and they were basically involved in making sure that they would serve to assist the young people. And of course, this was all done for racial reasons in the various places. And of course, the policing was so harsh. And I must mention that also at the Chicano Moratorium, and you could see in some of the footage that this was when the sheriff's departments were actually testing militarized weapons and militarized gases, and they were actually the first to use video capture for surveillance for later arrests. And I know of many people that were either arrested or beaten and harmed because their pictures had appeared on videotape at that point. And the various kind of techniques that were used were the kinds of things that we've seen just in the last few weeks.
Yes.
We've talked a lot here about the intergenerational connections that went back 1 and 2 generations of activism in the Mexican American community in LA. There was something new in the mid and late 60s, and that is at the beginning of the 60s, there was no concept of Chicano. This is a specific invention of the mid 60s, and it's extremely important because it's based on, before that, the idea of Mexican American was that the Mexicans are another immigrant group seeking to join the great American melting point and become part of America. They're going to be like Italian Americans and Irish Americans and Polish Americans. The idea of Chicanismo was, we're not regular hyphenated
Mhm.
immigrants. We are a separate, distinct group. We've been here for a much longer time than the
Right.
Irish Americans.
Right.
Harry, you were part of this. Maybe you want to explain a little bit more about the concept of Chicano. You were there when it was invented.
Right. So I think one of the things that maybe the word concept, it's actually pretty much like conceptual art in a way. It's that the terminology was selected and it's sort of to create an idea. And basically, it was like putting a new word in the dictionary that would actually, the definition would grow with the creation of works with that concept in mind. So, for instance, many people decided to become artists or musicians or writers with this concept of Chicano, sort of a self-identified, politicized Mexican in the United States. Understanding, though, of course, that we are Americans, but contributing to America under our own premise, as it were, as opposed to being dictated as to what our role would be. And of course, we do understand that even to this very day, the group is very much overlooked, not allowed to participate in the binary that exists today, which only allows for two very specific, distinct groups to have a conversation, particularly at a moment when many children who look like my grandchildren are put into cages. So I would have to say that this is a really an incredible outcome of ongoing racism and brutality and psychological torture. And it's taken it one step further, but in the end, you will find that one of the things that was really organized at a very early stage, and again, I think it even goes back to when I rejected public school at a very early age, that one requires a much higher level of information gathering and knowledge acquisition. And so fortunately, I encountered people and somehow I found myself as an educator, but there are many people that have constantly been involved and support. And of course, we had broad support from other groups, not just Chicanos, and many people were involved. And it's all been an ongoing struggle. And the thing, of course, is we all understand that we're all part of a very coherent struggle against oppression and fascism.
Devra, I have a question for you that I've been wanting to ask about your photographs. Devra, we have twice as many photographs of Devra's in our book as by any other photographer. And what struck me about your photographs, first of all, you're the one who photographed the young kids. So these are beautiful close. I mean, there's a million pictures of people marching in the streets, cops clubbing people holding up protest signs. These are the conventions. There's some very great pictures. Devra got up close, and these are almost like group portraits. And what we're seeing in these pictures, you'll get our book, you'll see is your engagement with these kids outside their schools as they're heading for protests. It's a really valuable, gives us a really important sense of who these kids were. And it's also a record of your engagement with them. How did you do that?
Well, thank you for that question. I think that one is I went to the interminable meetings, and I think that the kids knew that I, along with Raul and Manuel and the other photographers, were on their side. And you know the kids. The other thing, some of the leaders, Crisostomo, Mitre Paron, and so forth. And simply that in being on the streets and watching what was going on with the students behind these chainmail fence, like a jail, it looked like that. And there were even signs to that effect. You also had the kids on the outside. So one driving by with his sign, or the cars going by with signs about schools not prisons and chale and things. So you feel that, and you get to know people as time goes by. And it was very much, it was heartfelt. What can I say? It made a huge impression on me. And I said, that's what started me on the kind of history that I did.
They're wonderful pictures. I want to go back to the blowouts, these high school protests that Harry was one of the organizers of. I looked up what were the demands. The demands were smaller classes, bilingual ed, more counselors, a curriculum that included Mexican American history. This sounds kind of familiar. This sounds
Indeed.
It has reverberated for half a century. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest difference to me is that in 68 and 69, when Harry was leading the walkouts, there was a teachers union, and the teachers were against the kids. The teachers wanted cops in schools. The teachers wanted to kick out the troublemakers. If we look at the teacher strike of, was it just last year? The teachers, the families, and the kids are all on the picket lines together, and they're all demanding smaller classes, more counselors, bilingual ed.
Absolutely.
So there has been, the schools haven't accomplished what we wanted them to, but there has been a huge change in the teachers. And I think that may be because today's LA public school teachers are the children and grandchildren of the people who were in the streets 50 years ago.
Yeah, and actually, because of the walkouts, it did actually spur on the focus of education and to get so many people to want to go to school. And I do believe that this was the first year that such a large, incoming freshman crowd at UCLA was Latino. And so, of course, it's been increasing every year. And right at the time of the moratorium was also when the Chicano Studies Department had just kicked off at Cal State University Northridge. And so you started having people that were professionalized being involved in the movement. And of course, with every so many years, you started getting people that started passing the bar and becoming different people started getting elected, and other people, it just started spreading onward and forward. And of course, the population started shifting and growing, and the introduction of the availability of being able to speak other than English. And of course, now we live in Los Angeles, where there's over 100 languages spoken. Times have really changed in a certain manner. But the concern during the walkouts was specifically that people were being singled out, and of course, those that rose to the top were immediately drafted. So I know that at my high school graduation, there were students that were literally grabbed once they left the stage and were taken straight to Fort Ord. And so you had different kinds of situations happening back then, where quite literally was life or death. And of course, we had people that enlisted, of course, and that's one issue. But for those that were drafted against their will, that's a different issue. And not to mention that I think we're all in agreement that it was an illegal war to begin with. And so the whole premise of it was all wrong. And so when you think about all the lives that were lost, not only in East LA but throughout the United States, there was such a heavy price to pay for such bad judgment and basically greed, and something that we see driving things today. We have very similar death numbers now due to COVID, also based on greed. And so, and it is a war of a different sort. And so we have to be really tuned into making sure that education is constantly promoted and not denied to any child, as well as, and children need to be protected and given the rights that they have been announced by the Declaration of Children's Rights, which the U.S. has never signed.
You know, Harry, you've just made a very important connection to the present. The Chicano moratorium of 50 years ago was protesting in part the fact that Chicanos were dying at something like twice the rate of Anglos in Vietnam. And today, Chicanos are dying at much higher rates than Anglos from COVID-19.
Right.
It is a striking parallel.
That's an unfortunate parallel, yes.
And let's talk about how it got us to the present here. I think the moratorium of 50 years ago was like the biggest mobilization in the streets of Chicanos until at least, I mean, the real turning point for Mexican-American politics in California came with Prop 187, was that 92, which was sought to deny undocumented people all public services, including public school, including being treated in public hospitals. And that led to many tens of thousands. I think there were 70,000 people marched on City Hall and that really is that was a Republican program. So that's kind of the end of the Republican Party's fantasies that, well, maybe they can recruit Chicanos to be a counterweight to blacks. After that, blacks and Chicanos are going to be Democrats, and they've been ever since. And I think after that, the next big one was that May Day march, May 1st, 2006, after the new restriction at the border is a growing issue in Republican politics. Something like 1 million people marched down Wilshire Boulevard. I've never seen anything like May 1st, 2006. I imagine you were probably there too.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually at the one that was previous to that was declared being the Mega Marcha, which made all the international news throughout Europe and Latin America, but which was roundly avoided by the English language news, by the way. And so, but the one on Wilshire, of course, was absolutely one that was super dramatic. And of course, the counter to this was that there were 1 million people demonstrating, but the response was to deport 2 million people. And then this also set up the function of ICE, which then has now been transformed into the president's personal military and police force, which of course is really, really unfortunate that so many people who, again, going back to the moratorium, one of the things that's not usually explained, and Devra does have images of this, was that there were contingents of veterans from World War I, World War II, the Korean War, recent returnees from the Vietnam War, and all walks of life were present in East LA to support the end of the war. And again, this kind of continuum of all of us sharing very similar concerns, basically to address human rights and our civil rights, is something that at this point is really critical, and hopefully things can be solved in a way where not too many lives will be lost, and hopefully things will turn around. But again, that all depends what happens in November.
I also wanted just to say that one of the things that's also certainly a parallel with today is the killing by police and sheriffs of Latinos. And, you know, that on a regular basis, and much as it has been in the Black community, that the advent of iPhones and cameras have made it visible. But one of the writers from the LA Times said, the thing is about the shooting of Ruben Salazar, with this projectile that was only supposed to be used in Vietnam, is that it doesn't matter what they shot it, because they've been able to do what they wanted to without accountability. And that really continues and has continued. And I think it has changed some, but there still are questions, for example, the killing of Salazar. People heard 2 shots, and why was he able to have an open casket if his head had blown up? There's a lot of things like that. But so much of it is that they can get away with the stops, with the harassments, with the beating of Latinos and Latinas that is going on. And I think that's the commonality that this country has, and it's a long legacy of over 400 years of white supremacy. And so I just wanted to add that in terms of going ahead, that it's a very important issue.
And for the last 50 years, there's been a community legal battle to get the LAPD and the sheriffs under control. The ACLU has been suing the LAPD for 50 years. The community groups, the immigrants' rights groups have been suing the LAPD for 50 years. The LAPD, the city of LA, has paid out tens of millions of dollars to people who were victimized by the LA in violation of the rules. The police don't care. The tens of millions comes out of the general fund, not out of the police budget, so the police are happy that the city has to pay. They don't care, and they just keep doing it. That's one of the many things we'd like to change right now. Our time is flying here. Gilbert, do we have questions, or can I ask a few more of our guests? We're hoping.
We have a couple of questions, but you.
All right,
have,
well,
you have,
do you want to go to questions now?
Oh, sure, and then we can go back to asking other questions if we have follow-ups to these. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Great. So we have a question from Susan here, who is wondering about the man that shot Ruben Salazar. Where is Thomas Wilson now? Did he have a change of heart with old age and issue an apology?
You know, there's footage of him. He was interviewed by Philip Rodriguez in his film on Ruben Salazar, and he explains that he took a loaded canister to the inquest, willing to shoot anyone in the audience, and he was completely unrepentant, and he looked almost like he was ready to start using that itchy trigger finger even in the 21st century.
Wow, that is.
Let me just, while we're at it here, let's say their names, the two other people who were killed that day. I looked them up. Angel Gilbert Diaz, 35 years old, died when his car rammed into a telephone pole as he tried to escape from the police who were clubbing people. And Lynn Ward, a 15-year-old working as a Brown Berets medic, was killed when a burning trash can exploded. It had contained combustibles, we are told. So that's the death toll of that day.
Wow.
Gilbert, what else have we got?
We have a question here from Meg. How do the guests perceive the book American Dirt vis-a-vis their own experiences and knowledge of Chicano activism and history?
I read the debate over American Dirt, and I don't have plans to read it. That may answer the question.
Yeah, I think so.
I kind of have it was a gimmick by the Oprah Book Club, so I wasn't interested in it at all.
Which one is American Dirt? Remind me.
Oh, it was it came out in January. That was written by a white woman about a woman a Mexican woman who ends up becoming
the story of the migrant.
Yes.
Yeah,
involved with a drug
right.
lord or whatnot.
I did not. Sorry to say, I did not read it.
I don't think you have to apologize. I think you'll be okay. I want to let everybody know that's watching. You can still have time to put in the questions because we still have some time here if we want to continue. If you want to ask those questions, and John, I know you said you had other things, but actually, I do have a question for Harry and Devra. I know as artists, and Devra, you were already there shooting and capturing the moments, and how did that time was that direct catalyst for you continuing your art or beginning your art, or was that something that you were already kind of in the midst of for both you and Harry? But yeah, go ahead first.
Well, I was a photographer because I loved it, but I loved taking photographs in the movie. I mean, that was very much part of it. So they were intertwined. Now, what it did have an effect of, and by then I'm already caught, is I began to write history and do research about the Mexican community and their involvement in other organizations, and that became my life work. So I'm just about to be working with my older negatives. When you're on paper, you go through things, pick things to print, and move on. And but it's an ongoing, really pleasure and to me to be around this community, part of these things. It's been wonderful in a lot of ways. I also grew up in Chicano, so that makes a difference too.
Mm-hmm.
That's but it was an inspiration.
And Harry, how about?
Well, I had the idea that everything I had seen was actually true during the experience of the moratorium. But then the next day, when all the news media did the report, they told a counter narrative that was completely falsified, vilifying the Chicano community, making it seem as though we were violent, kind of disparaging. Of course, I grew up an entire period where at any given moment, negative stereotypes were portrayed on television or in cinema or even in any kind of utterance, and of course not reflected positively in any of the textbooks or in anything that would be affirmative of the Chicano experience, and which was counter to my experience. I knew so many people that had great dignity, great standing, very interesting ideas, and I felt that my opinion would be supported by maybe providing some pictures, as it were. I bought my first camera shortly after the moratorium, and actually at the moratorium, I was invited by Francisco Flores to be the editor of Regeneración magazine, in which I then sought out artists to work with, and it was working with these artists that we would wind up performing and doing things specifically where we were not allowed to do things in a way of countering the message, and I've been taking pictures ever since, and I'm sure I've taken more than 1 million photographs, of which a few have gotten out into the world. But it became very evident that it's very important to have imagery and words and ideas. And going back to you, John, this idea of having a concept to promote the notion of Chicano as being something rather contemporary, something very necessary, something very important, and all about contributing to the overall knowledge of the global population. And so, and that's been my work ever since, and continues to be.
I mean, Harry's being a little too modest here.
Yes, he is.
Harry was on the cover of Art Forum magazine, the leading art magazine of the world, probably, when he was about, 20 years old, because of ASCO. Tell us a little bit, which is a very unusual kind. This is not documentary journalism. This is explain.
So somewhere along the line, I came up with an idea of, I guess I'd always been a cinephile and watched a lot of films, but I was also interested in the mechanics and the physics about television, audio, and cinema, and realized that we watch movies, but we never actually see anything move. It's all a series of still imagery, but I was always moved by film, and I grew up always on the streets and always encountering actors, people who were very famous when they're off screen, and realized that this is all something that's been created for us to view. And I felt that every time I saw a film, I'd walk away with a singular image in my mind, and I got the idea to create the singular image that was very cinematic, minus making the rest of the movie. And so this approach I referred to as no movie, and was able to, and because of my kind of expert interaction with some of the people that I had been mentored by, found myself constantly trying to reach members of the media and in the academia and other fields, and was able to get my images out into conscious awareness of people who were empowered to make something of it. And so very early on, the images that are now associated with the OSCO group and other groups, I have another series known as Chicano Male Unbonded, that have kind of been viewed worldwide. Currently, some of these works actually are on view at the Ludwig Museum in Cologne, Germany. And so they're constantly in museum settings, in various books, and of course, and I guess every time I take a photograph, it generates a brand new PhD somewhere.
And I keep thinking, Harry, of your first show at Lafayette, which was outside, and then your second one in it.
Yeah, so in 1972, of course, we spray painted LACMA, but and that was my initial interaction because basically Chicanos were excluded, and I was somehow denounced by the curator there at that point. But the idea was that really I was there to remind them that Chicanos belong in the museum. and it took 40 years, and finally that particular image, which is known as spray paint LACMA, was actually exhibited inside the museum. And I think, given if you know, it's just one of these kind of things where you know, you'll take a photograph, but some actually take a life of their own, and some generate conversation, and others become signifiers of a moment. For instance, Devra's work in the book, they're very beautiful, and Jon, of course, it's that idea where you kind of you humanize the people that were in the march, Devra, which is what's wonderful, which normally is, again, it's the idea that when you have mass media and the corporate media, it will create sort of these nameless, faceless masses that are very easily stereotyped. But once you recognize someone as being an actual human being, it's very difficult to denounce them without having good cause. And of course, there is no good cause.
The names are important.
And
so Gilbert, we've reached the top of the hour here, which is when we promised we would pass the torch back to you.
Yeah. I have one more question. I'm allowed to squeeze it in there. So I think, and I kind of want to, as kind of a wrap up for kind of the whole kind of scope of the book. Obviously, we're talking about the moratorium, Chicano moratorium, and the anniversary, but obviously the scope of the book is wider than that. In that it takes in the movements that were going around all around Los Angeles, which is counter to what Harry was talking about as far as the mass media's portrayal of who was around for that stuff, you know, and who was making the things happen, and LA in general as the, you know, beach, Hollywood, whatever, you know, kind of, you know, broad strokes, as opposed to these, you know, the people that lived here, you know, the people that were the true life of this area, and made it what it was. And it seems like we're here 50 years later, and we still struggle to get that narrative out there. We still struggle to see that portrayal. And I would imagine, I wanted to kind of put it to you, Jon, for you and Mike, and when you were approaching this, was that an important aspect of kind of trying to counter the erasure of not only the Chicano movement, but the Black Power movement, and, you know, the queer movement, and, you know, the advent of, you know, Asian Americans and everything that was happening. Was this a kind of foundational thing as you approached this book?
Yeah. We, you know, our point is, when people, as you say, when people think of LA in the 60s, they think of surfers, or they think of the music scene, you know, in Laurel Canyon, or but as Mike wrote, the working class heroes of our story live in the great flatlands of Los Angeles. And their story really hasn't been told, and there's a lot more of it that we haven't told. We feel the book is 800 pages long. We feel we've just scratched the surface. There's so many things we left out. There's so much more that happened after this, and we're just hoping that other younger historians pick up the torch and tell the rest of the story, and tell what happens next, and that they deploy the imagery for people like Harry and Devra, which is so important to understanding the working class heroes of the flatlands.
I just want to say also that it's a terrific book, and I learned a lot about things that I was around but didn't necessarily know. And it's such a base, and you're so inviting also about having the younger historians put on to that discussion. And it really does put LA up in a way that it should be put on the map. And I so appreciate the book, Jon. I really do. And please convey that. Great questions.
Yeah,
thank you.
And thank you, Jon, for embracing everyone and the struggle that we all are engaged in, and to fit it all within neatly with 800 pages, which, of course, I'm sure, knowing both of you, it could have been 8,000 pages. Still scratch the surface, but you know, the story will continue, and as we know, the stories are continuing this very minute today. So you know, we encourage everyone to you know, really defend your rights, and do that through acknowledgement of your own humanness and the humanness of others.
Yes.
So I just want to say thank you to Harry Gamboa, thank you to Devra Weber, and thank you, Gilbert, and thanks to Romans for this wonderful hour.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We are so happy that you were all able to join us for this, and thank you to everybody that tuned in. For anybody that you know that may be interested in watching this discussion, once we're finished up here, you can use the same link that you used for this to access this. As a recorded piece afterwards. And then you can also visit the Vroman's YouTube channel, where we'll upload this discussion as well in about within the next week or so. Also, please, by all means, everybody that's taking the time to watch this, click on that button down there at the bottom where it says "Bye, set the night on fire," because yeah, after this, you'll definitely want to read the book, and please, we encourage you to do that. Thank you for supporting independent bookstores during this time. I know it's a struggle for everybody, and we really appreciate the time that you've taken to be here. So, with that being said, thanks again.
Yeah.
Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.